all of it feeds the same purpose. So in sprinting, hip extension pattern, super important. Spinal engine pattern, really, really important. The ability to do that forcefully, really quickly, and orienting the forces in the right direction, that's the entire sport. So we try to build them, we try to identify what within each specific athlete are the primary gaps that we need to fill within that from a load perspective. Do we have an athlete that is, let's have a look at the graph of diminishing returns, and on the ability to apply force is only on a 7 out of 10. Well, maybe we work a lot more on the application of force or the generation of force for that athlete than when we would if we had, say, a 30-year-old elite sprinter who's already a 9.5 out of 10 on their ability to apply force. But it's more about the orientation of force for that one. Or maybe it's a little bit more about getting greater access into hip extension. So we might be doing some slower stuff or some slower isometric work and so on and so forth. So it's two ways then, right? It's one, it's looking at those invariant things that are important for everybody. What are the shapes? What are the patterns? How do we look at loading those? So some of the loading will be super frequent and kind of low. Some of the loading will be really quite intense, but less frequent, right? So it's on one end of the spectrum, you've got these hormetic loads that we're doing all the time. On the other end of the spectrum, you've got these kurtotic loads that may be loading once every 3 days, once every 4 days, once every couple of weeks, so on and so forth. And then everything that exists within the middle, right? Or in between those two poles on that continuum. So it's that, right? And then the variant stuff is where each individual athlete is within their own specific development. As I said, you'll have, if I've got an 18-year-old kid who's nowhere near maximizing their ability to apply force, then that's the low-hanging fruit for that athlete, right? I'm going to improve their force application ability over most other things. Whereas if I've got a 28-year-old or that same 18-year-old, but just 10 years later, it's no longer about the application of force. It's much more about the rate of force, the orientation of force. But the patterns and the shapes that are most relevant to the sport are still there. It's the same sport. So
I think people think of track as also being a very kind of repetitive sport, particularly sprinting, when for sure in acceleration, nothing could be further from the truth. The shapes are changing quite dramatically, especially during initial acceleration for athletes, right? So there's this constant change within the movement that you're looking at, not just from a, pattern perspective, but from a shape perspective, which is like the classic thing that people focus on. But there is patterning, rhythms, shapes, all those things are constantly changing. And I also wanted to say, to be clear, like, we don't discount any training modality. Like, we find that there is a place potentially for anything depending on the athlete. I don't want listeners to think that we're just going into the weight room and only doing esoteric functional movements. There is a place for certain athletes. We go in and lift heavy. They might deadlift heavy, they might squat heavy, they might Olympic lift. For some, it may not be necessary at the stage of their career for the, for what they're displaying us in terms of their movement abilities, or capabilities. So, again, I want to be clear, we do some of the classic things as well, interspersed with other forms of training. So there was a place and time for everything, potentially depending on the athlete and what they need to be successful.